Aaron Koller is professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University. He's held research positions at Cambridge University and in the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, has been a visiting professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and was a fellow at the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research in East Jerusalem and the Hartman Institute in West Jerusalem. Go Hartman. Okay. He's the author of Esther in Ancient Jewish Thought and Unbinding Isaac, the Akedah from Modern Jewish Thought, which I will just say I had the opportunity to read and then to teach and think about and analyze a few years ago, and I've enjoyed both of these books tremendously. He is the editor of 5 more books and currently working on a cultural history of the alphabet. Lives in Queens, and most importantly, with his partner Shira Hecht Koller, who just began a new rabbinical program run by the Hartman Institute and their children. And I'm now going to invite forward Frances Greenberg to talk a little bit about this weekend and how it came to be, and her wonderful family and their efforts to make this happen. Thank you, Frances.
Yeah, you can do. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat.
I'm Frances Klein, Frances Greenberg Klein. My husband, Steve, is out here. You can't hear me?
Hey, put him right next to you.
Right next to me.
Right next to you.
And I'm the middle child of, you could. I'm the middle child of Ruth and Bernie Greenberg. And on behalf of my family, I'd like to thank Beth Shalom Congregation and staff, especially, Bethel. I belong to Beth Shalom. Bethel Synagogue, especially Rabbi Graber and Ed Fleischman for organizing and hosting this program. And my brothers, Stan and Ray, and I grew up down the road in Chapel Hill when it was still a village. And our parents drove us back and forth to Bethel multiple times each week. And we all celebrated B'nai Mitzvot and confirmations at Bethel, despite our typical childhood resistance to attending Hebrew school. We did build strong foundations in Judaism here. Both of our parents were educators, strong advocates of secular and Jewish education, and they taught us by example the importance of lifelong pursuit of learning. Our father was a native of New York, professor and dean of public health at UNC, and was the first faculty member of either Duke or Carolina to serve as the president of Beth El, where he championed Jewish education. Our mother, a North Dakotan, received a master's degree in biochemistry from Yale at a time when women were rarely accepted there, and taught at NC State to support our family while my dad was getting his graduate degree. My mom was also active in Bethel and for many years participated in a Bethel Chavarah dedicated to exploring a wide variety of Jewish topics. It's an honor and a blessing for our family to establish this endowment fund to be administered by Bethel in memory of our parents. The goal of the fund is to provide and encourage Jewish learning opportunities for all ages. The active participation and contributions of the Bethel community are essential to this endowment fund for its future success. And then I would also like to introduce my niece, Nomi Greenberg, who is the oldest of my parents' grandchildren. She's a Sabra. She was born in Israel, and she's an active member and educator in Temple, Emmanuel, and Winston-Salem, and she'd like to say a few words.
Shabbat Shalom לכולם. My name is Naomi Greenberg, and I'm the eldest of 5 grandchildren of Ruthie and Bernie Greenberg. My father, Stan Greenberg, is the eldest of the 3 Greenberg siblings, and I'm honored to read his words to you today. Stanley was born and bred in North Carolina. Upon graduating from UNC in 1971, he made Aliyah to Kibbutz Kabri in the Western Galilee, and our family still resides and are members there. The 3 Greenberg children, Francis, Ray, and Stan, were honored to create a fund enabling Bethel to hold an annual workshop centered on learning and open discussion. Ruthie and Barney came to North Carolina through the generosity and foresight of others, furthering higher education and research. The Chapel Hill, Durham Jewish community was an important factor in their decision to stay here and raise a family. We are honored to help continue this dedication to Jewish life and learning. It is a small gesture to continue the culture and worldview of previous Bethel congregants. We hope tonight's discussion will strengthen this dedication to thoughtful dialogue. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I want to thank especially Rabbi Graber, sorry, and Ed for the work that's gone into this that I know of. I know there was also a lot of work behind the scenes, and for those who I don't know toiled for this, thank you as well. One of the treats of getting to be invited to be here for this weekend was having the excuse to read about the Greenbergs. These are people who, I'm not a biostatistician, I have nothing to do with North Carolina. I would have had no reason to learn about the family, and yet when I looked them up, I just kept finding amazingly interesting articles about them. Clearly remarkable people, and they were my own window from New York into what is indeed a remarkable community with a deep and rich history and a deep culture. The Greenbergs seem to typify the kind of pillars of the community that have been here, both professionals and even academics when you tolerate them. And within academics, there are not only scientists, there are sometimes even humanists. So I'm grateful that there is that openness to all sorts of different kinds of strange people here. And despite all the professional accomplishments that are in this room and have been in this room for so many decades, it's also clear that one of the hallmarks of the community is that people are dedicated to the community. And that's something that came up in everything that I read about the Greenbergs. There was one story about a question that was asked to your mom of when your dad could have possibly have found time to sleep, given all of his professional commitments and his commitments to the synagogue. And she said, he doesn't. Which I don't know, but lots of people get that question, but fewer people have that answer. All right, I have been working for some years on, Rabbi Graber mentioned, a cultural history of the alphabet. I find the alphabet to be fascinating. It's a technology that was invented roughly 4,000 years ago, and at this point is used by 98% of the countries in the world. Just a story of how it went from a marginal invention in a corner of the world where no one really cared to being a technology that has swept around the world is a fascinating story. And that's a story that I've been working on. As you can expect, every time I open something new, I discover that there's a whole new chapter of this that I didn't know about. So the project's been dragging on. That's fine. It keeps me interested, and eventually it'll get finished. But as I've been working on this, I'll tell people, I'm working on a cultural history of the alphabet. And the almost immediate first question is, which alphabet? The English alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet? So the first thing I want to say is that virtually all alphabets in the world are cousins. They're all a family tree of alphabets, and they come from a moment when the alphabet was invented. That doesn't, of course, mean that all alphabets today are the same, but they are all on a family tree. It was invented about 4,000 years ago, probably in an Egyptian desert. The details are, as you can expect for things 4,000 years ago, a bit sketchy, but certainly in a place where people would have been aware of Egyptian hieroglyphs and spoke a language in the Semitic family, much like Hebrew. So we need that sort of combination. One possibility is the Sinai Desert. There is a site called Sirabit al-Khadim, which is a tiny little, used to be a series of turquoise mines. That's now just a barren archaeological site in the desert, where we have some of the earliest alphabetic texts in the world. It doesn't, of course, mean that they were invented there, but it's a site to think about as a possible place where this whole story may have begun. A couple of years ago, I had a chance to visit the site, sort of traipse across the Sinai Desert for a few days with only a Bedouin as my traveling companion. Jack's gonna be mad at me, but my Bedouin Arabic is not good. His English was non-existent. So my Bedouin Arabic was better than his English, which is saying something. So we basically walked around the desert for silence for 4 days or so. It was an amazing opportunity. One of the texts that from that site, it's now actually not there, it's in Cairo in the museum. It will be in this Grand Egyptian Museum, assuming that they ever open it, is this little sphinx that you have. I'm sorry, I apologize. Most of the texts are in Cairo. This one's in the British Museum. This little sphinx that you have in the top left picture, it's really quite small. Don't think about the giant sphinx in Giza. And it's something of the Rosetta Stone of the early alphabet. Because if you see, and you can see they've chalked it in the British Museum, there's a hieroglyphic inscription on the front right corner. And then under it, there are some strange looking signs in a row. And those strange looking signs are among the earliest alphabetic writing that we have. Now, it's a Rosetta Stone of sorts because the two inscriptions turn out to say the same thing. The top one in hieroglyphs says, beloved of Hathor, Meriet Hathor. Hathor is a goddess, an Egyptian goddess, among other things, of turquoise. And below it, in something like Hebrew, but not exactly Hebrew, there's something like Mi'uhab Ba'alat. Also from Ahav, so beloved of Ba'alat, of the lady. So it's more or less the same content. When I went to Sirabit al-Khadim, the picture to the right of that is a carving of Hathor. I was starstruck, right? It's like meeting, like I don't have so many celebrities that I care about, but Hathor was like, yeah. So I did what you're supposed to do when you meet a celebrity, which is take a selfie. I didn't come out so good. I thought she looked a little stiff in the picture, but in any event, I couldn't not take a selfie with it. Now, the alphabet, think about 4,000 years ago, that means that the alphabet is almost a millennium older than the people of Israel. How you date the people of Israel is a vague question, like what would that even mean? Where do you put the beginning of it? But the people of Israel in the land of Israel as a society that we can see archaeologically is almost 1,000 years later than that, in what we call the very end of the late Bronze Age or the beginning of the Iron Age, depending on all sorts of variables that really don't matter right now. And I gave you some dates at the bottom of the page here that just for orientation, I'm not going to read them, but if at any point things get a little bit confusing, so those are there for you to consult. From already the 12th, 11th centuries, we have some very small, short inscriptions from the land of Israel. Most of them are not linguistically interesting. In other words, they write the alphabet. But how do you know what language the person who writes the alphabet speaks? You don't know if they speak Phoenician or Aramean or Hebrew. The alphabet was used by all of those people in the area of what archaeologists like to call the Levant. So people speaking different languages use the same letter forms, but we do have some inscriptions, picture here is not super clear, so maybe I'm not going to ask you to read the inscription out loud. But this, on the top of the next page, you have one of the more spectacular finds of the last couple of decades, a little astrakhan from a site called Khirbet Kayafa in the Shvela, west of Jerusalem, which I'm not even sure you can see in the picture. If you can't, I will be happy to email you better. You can Google it and find really good pictures online, actually. But the letters don't look anything like modern Hebrew letters. They also don't look anything like ancient Hebrew letters. If you've seen old Hebrew letters, if you've gone to archaeological sites in Israel, what's called Tav Ivri, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but the old Hebrew script doesn't really look like that either. It's an even older stage of the alphabet than what we call the old Hebrew script. Letters are turned in different directions. They're pictorial more than linear. But there's all sorts of questions about how to read this text. But plausibly, this 6 lines of writing, and actually is in Hebrew, because of the uniqueness of the archaeological site. It's a site that happens to have been occupied for only one generation. We know it's 10th century, which is the time of, let's say, Solomon and his immediate successor, maybe even the time of David, depending, again, on some technicalities in the archaeology. But this is a text that's plausibly the oldest text that we can say is in the alphabet and is linguistically Hebrew. In other words, depending on how we read it, there might be some words here, some expressions that are only in Hebrew, that aren't found in Aramaic or Phoenician. Sorry. But again, the alphabet broadly is a shared technology. So a millennium earlier, people were writing in really only 2 scripts, the ancient Near East. In Egypt, well, Egypt has 2 scripts, but Egypt has its own scripts, and then everyone else is using a script that they got from Mesopotamia, which you've certainly encountered, called cuneiform. And cuneiform can be used to write any language, and in theory, any script can be used to write any language. Like Rabbi Graber pointed out, the transliteration in the Siddur, right? That's using English script, quote unquote English script, to write Hebrew words. So in theory, script and language can be mixed and matched. And people use cuneiform, script from Mesopotamia, to write all sorts of languages around the Near East. But by about 1000, this alphabet had started to grow. And the Arameans and the Phoenicians and the Israelites, among others, Moabites, a bunch of other peoples, latch on to this new writing system, and they use it for their languages. Scholars who are obsessive a bit about the shapes of letters will tell you that the angle on the letter bet is different in Aramaic than it is in Hebrew. And these things are really important because you get an inscription, you want to know who wrote it, especially if it shows up out of archaeological context, which fortunately happens a lot. Then those kinds of studies can be very helpful. But when we zoom out, the more striking fact is not the differences, but the commonalities. The alphabet is spreading throughout this area of the world. Now, the Phoenicians, in particular, they get a lot of play, a lot of press when people talk about the history of the alphabet. It's nothing to do with their literary tradition. We actually have very little Phoenician writing from Phoenicia. What they bring to the historical table here is that they were the great merchants in the Mediterranean Sea. They're the ones who, already in the 9th century, found Carthage, all the way off to the west. They're in Huelva in Spain. There are reports that they've gone down the western coast of Africa. But certainly in the Mediterranean, they're the ones circulating and bringing goods from place to place. We can stick just in the eastern Mediterranean, and so they're the conduits from what we would think of as the land of Israel and Gaza and Lebanon and Syria, that coast, off to Greece, which is not that far, Cyprus, and then even further to the west. Along with their goods, of course, they bring ideas. Right? You can't trade with someone without talking. And one of the technologies that they bring from east to west is the alphabet. So at around 800, maybe a little bit later. Again, debates that you can get into the weeds of these debates, but actually the big picture is much more interesting. Around 800 or a little bit later, the Greeks start writing in the alphabet. Now, Greeks had writing back in the Bronze Age. They used scripts that we now call very descriptive things like linear A and linear B. But linear B had gone out in around 1200 BCE, and for 400 years, the Greeks do not write. Again, a story that's interesting in its own right, but the alphabet comes in and they start writing again. The Greeks are fascinating because the Greeks do a couple of things that no one else does. The most striking and famous thing that really does change the world and change the way that we write is that they immediately add vowel letters systematically. So if you've read the Torah or read any other old Hebrew text, you know that there sometimes are vowel letters. Right? There might be a vav standing for an O or an U, or a yud that stands for an E or an A, or a hey at the end that stands for an ah. There are sporadic vowel letters, but the Greeks insist that every single vowel be marked with its own letter. That's a radical shift. That really does change what the alphabet does. So it goes from being the sort of skeleton of the word with some aids for reading to a systematic way of writing every single sound of the word. So I'm not going to pursue this, but very quickly the alphabet moves from Greece to Italy. And then later on, it sort of stays there for a few centuries, but later on, when this little town in the middle of Italy becomes the great power of all of the Mediterranean and of Europe, the Romans bring the alphabet to all of North Africa and to Europe, and in that particular form that we call the Latin form, right, which we still use. So that's a part of the story that goes in its own direction. I'm not going to pursue it there. I'm going to come back to the Middle East in a second. But the other thing that the Greeks do is they immediately start writing really quirky, interesting text. So when other peoples get the alphabet, they tend to write, at least what we see, there's two kinds of things. Really short, almost graffiti-like things, maybe just the alphabet written out or someone's name, and royal inscriptions. So like you could spend the next 20 minutes reading the entire corpus of Moabite literature, because it consists essentially of two royal inscriptions that we have. So and then you can put on your CV that you know Moabite. But the Greeks, what we see immediately in the 8th century are things like these pots that you have on the bottom of the second page, which have really interesting, like, personable inscriptions. So the pots talk, the pots have a voice, and they say things like this: Nestor's cup, presumably a reference to something Homer, is good to drink from. But he who drinks from this cup, immediately desire of fair garlanded Aphrodite will seize him. Now, if you remember what Aphrodite is the goddess of, and you realize that this cup is holding wine, and it's a fairly big cup. So if you drink that much wine, desire of fair garlanded Aphrodite may indeed seize him. But these are the kind of things that we get in Greece. They use it for like idiosyncratic, which I don't mean in a negative sense, but really interesting kind of inscriptions. They clearly take this new technology and sort of graft it onto their banqueting culture that already exists, onto a literary culture that had previously been oral, and they take this technology and they run with it. They do all sorts of interesting things with it. So Greece deserves its reputation as an important point in the history of the alphabet. But again, I'm going to come back to the Middle East now, and now I'm going to focus really on the Jewish side and on Hebrew. So there's a couple of things that are interesting and enigmatic in the biblical period. The one use that later Jews used the alphabet for was the technique called gematria. You can tell from the word that's not a Hebrew word. Right? The word itself is borrowed from Greek. But what is gematria? Exactly, right? So taking the number values of the letters and then doing things with them, right? Like I actually read in the Siddur tonight, I don't know, maybe you were all praying proper intention. But, but I was reading the marginal notes, and it says that the first letters of the 6 Psalms of Kabbalat Shabbat add up to the gematria of 430, which is also the gematria of nefesh, the word that Rabbi Graber alluded to, a soul. So it's a soulful 6th Psalm. So it's a lovely thought. I have no idea how seriously the author takes this. Yeah. Oh. Very nice. All right. Good. So you can put gematria to all sorts of interesting uses. It's usually been thought that this is all like post-biblical. Right? I mean, the word gematria is Greek. Like this comes up later on. But a colleague of mine, some probably know, named Israel Knoll, an Israeli scholar, thinks that he sees some gematria in the Bible itself. And this is intriguing enough that I want to share it with you. I think it's actually too good to not be right. So he points to 2 of the oldest poems in the Hebrew Bible. And I gave you the Hebrew on the top because it only works in the Hebrew. So at the top of the 3rd page, this is the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15. Sorry. And Moses' song in Deuteronomy 32. And these have, they have a lot of interesting linguistic and literary features in common that scholars like to point out, and they call them, therefore, archaic biblical poems. But Knoll pointed to a feature that has nothing to do with linguistics, really. He pointed out that both of them start with, depends on how you break up the lines, with 3 lines that sum total 26 words. 26 words in the first 3 lines. Now, 26, Kabbalists, if there were any Kabbalists here, jump up and say, 26, of course, that's the gematria. You don't know what that's the gematria of? The 4-letter name of God, right? Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. 10 and 5 and 6 and 5 adds up to 26. 5, 10, right? Even us humanists can do that math. So 26. There's 26 words, and both of them end with a reference to the name of God. So not just to the name of God, but they say the name of God. In other words, Shem Hashem, the name of God, or Hashem Shemo. His name is Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. So Knoll says, look, I mean, what are the chances you have 26 words ending with the name that has a gematria of 26? Now, again, I think that's too good to be not true. There's a lot of open questions, though, right? So when you do gematria, typically, we got to 430 pretty quickly, right? How do you get to 430? Because in conventional gematria, once you get past 10, start counting by 10. Right? Kaf is 20, Lamed is 30. Then when you get to 100, you start counting by hundreds. From this, we have no idea what happens after 10, right? Like the biggest number here we would have is Yud. So it's conceivable that Kaf would just be 11, right? And we don't have this sort of full-blown gematria system. So there's lots of open questions. I don't need to point out all we don't know, but it's an intriguing possibility that even in biblical times, Israelites were attuned to the numerical significance of it, and with a key word like the name of God, they may have even crafted literature around that, right? Because again, the point is that the first 3 lines have a total of 26 words. The poems are written to match the numerical value of the name of God. I'll leave it as an open question, but I think an intriguing one. I give you a chart in the middle of the 3rd page, which you can get these things in various places. The Israel Museum back in like the 60s or 70s printed a really beautiful chart of all the letters of the alphabet and sort of how they traveled around the world. I gave you this just to sort of exemplify with a few letters where the letters go from their origins. The hieroglyphs are not an alphabet, but they're models and hieroglyphs. Early alphabet, what we call the Old Hebrew alphabet in the Iron Age, and then, and this is what I'm going to talk about right now, this transition to what we call the square script or the Aramaic script, which looks a lot like modern Hebrew. So that transition takes place in the aftermath of the Babylonian exile. The Talmud actually talks about this. The rabbis of the Talmud say that they attribute it to the agency of Ezra the scribe, who leads a few tens of thousands of Jews back from Babylonia to Judea in the middle of the 5th century BC. So for the rabbis, this is a particular person who did it. When we look at it archaeologically, we see it as a slower process, but time is about right. And it was around what we call the Persian period, starting in the late 6th and going to the 5th centuries. We start to see the Jews dropping the older form of the alphabet that they had used in the land of Israel for the last 600 years or so, and adopting the form of the alphabet that was in wide use at that point, which the rabbis of the Talmud actually call the Assyrian script, but modern scholars call the Aramaic script, as I said, because it was in use by many people at that point for the use of the language of Aramaic, which had become the language of the Near East. So we have letters from Egypt that are written in Aramaic that use the square letters, the Aramaic script, and we have letters from Uzbekistan, from Bukhara, that look exactly the same. So this alphabet has been spreading through the Middle East, and the Jews start to adopt it. So we start to see it on seal impressions, we start to see it on coins, and over the next couple of centuries, the Jews adopt this square script. By the time we get to the end of Second Temple time, Roman time, the Old Hebrew script is mostly relegated to marginal use. Still there, we see it, tombstone here or there. Interestingly, we see it on coins of the Great Revolt and also of Bar Kokhba's revolt, which is interesting because that's way later than we think Jews have stopped using it. And then it certainly suggested to people that in some circumstances, it has a political use. Bar Kokhba, remember, is a nationalist rebel against the Roman Empire, and it is plausible that he is bringing back the sort of alleged native script and saying, you know what, on our coins, we're not going to use this cosmopolitan, assimilated Aramaic script. We're going to go back to our roots. We're going to use the old Hebrew script that our ancestors used as a symbol of the quest for national autonomy and independence that he's after. But it is a slow process, shift from old Hebrew script to the Aramaic script. And again, I want to emphasize that the rabbis of the Talmud are absolutely aware of it. They talk about it, they say this happened centuries and centuries ago. That's when the Jews abandoned the old Hebrew script and adopted the Aramaic. And yet, those same rabbis, the same Talmud, say things like what you have on the bottom of the 3rd page. Rabbi Jonah said in the name of Rabbi Levi, why was the world created with the letter Bet? Now let's just pause. What would give him the idea that the world was created with the letter Bet? All right, you guys are, you could be midrashis. Yeah, that's great. So the world is created with the letter Bet. So why Bet? So once you ask the question, it's an interesting question, right? Like, if you're going to think of this as significant, like, why did the Torah open with the letter Bet? I mean, open with Aleph, right? If it had opened with Aleph, there'd be no question. Why open with Bet then? To teach that, just as the Bet is closed on all 3 sides and opened only in the front, so does one not have the right to inquire, listen carefully, about what is above and what is below, what is behind, but only about time since the day the world was created. So they learn a theological lesson from the shape of the Bet. So the Bet looks like this, and remember this is the beginning of the line. So above, below, and behind it is blocked. The only thing open is from here on in. So block theological inquiry as to everything before the Torah, which is itself a fascinating idea, right? Like, just don't ask so many questions. Some questions don't need to be asked. But the Bet, the shape of the Bet, teaches this lesson. Now, that is true in the Bet that you know, right? But that's not true in the old Hebrew Bet. I give you the old Hebrew Bet on the bottom to the right. It's not open to the front. It's not closed, right? It's just a different shape. It's actually a little triangle with a leg. But the rabbis who absolutely know that the Bet that they know, that they use, is not the original Bet, are still happy to derive a lesson from the shape of the Bet that's in use. There are some more examples that I'm not going to read, but they derive similar lessons from the shape of the letter Hey, the shape of the letter Yud. And again, in every single case, these midrashim don't work unless you assume the sort of modern shape of the letter. So I want to just reflect on this for a moment, because the rabbis, I think, are avoiding a confusion that many people do make. Some people conflate antiquity and originality with sanctity. And I think the rabbis are very much attuned to the fact that those are different questions. Originally, they know the Torah didn't look like a bet with an open front, because they told us that the Torah was originally written in Old Hebrew letters. But that's not the key question. There's sanctity in the letters that we use, because these are the letters that we use for the Torah today. And they even have a rule that a Torah, an actual Torah scroll, that is written in Old Hebrew script is not fit for use. It's not sacred. You might think even more sacred. We're going back to like the Torah as it looked in Isaiah's time. The rabbi said, no. I don't know what, maybe that is what the Torah looked like in Isaiah's time. It doesn't matter. That's not the Torah as it looks today. Sanctity doesn't come from being very old. Sanctity comes from the use that we put these letters to. And our Torah, they're not innovating this, but our Torah as we write it, uses the Aramaic script, these square letters, and that's what's sacred. The fact that it used to be different, that's interesting historically, but it's irrelevant in terms of sacred. Now, as we go later in history, I think a different sort of sanctity of the Hebrew alphabet develops, and this is the last point that I'll leave you with. For many centuries, and all around the world, Jews developed Jewish languages that were often written. Sometimes they were just oral, but very often they were written. And these include, sort of most famously, in Central and Eastern Europe, Yiddish, in the Islamic world, Judeo-Arabic, and in Spain, and then the Spanish version, Ladino. So eventually these are all around the world, but originally, of course, they have homeland. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure you can read these texts that I gave you here, but the three texts that you have at the bottom of the last page, you have a Yiddish text on the right, a Judeo-Arabic text in the middle, and a Ladino text on the left. Without reading too carefully, what do you notice about all three of them? Fantastic. They're all written in the Hebrew script. And even though, linguistically speaking, Judeo-Arabic is Arabic, and Ladino is a Romance language, and Yiddish is Germanic, when you look at it, you know immediately that this is a Jewish text. Right? And Jews did this all around the world. Jews spoke a version of the vernacular. That was a Jewish version of the vernacular, but they could speak the vernacular. But when they came to write, they immediately went to the Hebrew alphabet. We have some really fascinating cases because the Cairo Geniza gives us so much evidence that otherwise we would never have had of how people use writing in everyday life. It happens to have the earliest Yiddish literature, which is a bit confusing, because as in Cairo. But it also, we get things like people transliterating the Quran into Hebrew script. Now, we don't know why they're reading the Quran. It's possible that it's seen as having magical protective value, but whatever it is, these are Jews in Cairo, but they're much more comfortable, even in real Arabic, using the Hebrew alphabet than Arabic alphabet. Maimonides, the great Jewish leader in Cairo at one of the height of the time of the Cairo Geniza, who was the doctor for some points of his life to the Sultan's court, writes out his medical advice in Hebrew characters, they have his handwriting, and then gives it to someone else to transliterate. Now, he speaks Arabic. It's not the language, it's just a script, because Jews write in the Hebrew alphabet. And this is a different kind of sanctity that I worry a little bit about in our own world. because this is a kind of sanctity that marks identity. The kind of sanctity that has, for many, many centuries, bound Jews around the world, despite linguistic differences, despite all sorts of differences of practice and belief, but binds them in their script. Now, for a long time, the Hebrew language was the other side of that coin, because Jews everywhere also read Hebrew. That's also something that we struggle with today. Right? In our richest and most educated diaspora ever, Hebrew has paradoxically become a great struggle. So that's a struggle that we as a diaspora community have. Hebrew language, and I say this with a heavy heart, has become very politicized in the last generation. So I know lots of young people who maybe in the middle of the 20th century would have been moved by their ideologies and their connections to their Jewish roots to go study Hebrew, maybe join a kibbutz, live there for a couple of years, come back rejuvenated. Today, Hebrew and young people have a complicated relationship. But interestingly, some of those young people are actually reviving Yiddish. Some, fewer, but some, have renewed an interest in Ladino. Now, what these have in common, again, that they're written in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, there's no way to get away from Israel when we think about the Hebrew alphabet today, and I personally have no real interest in getting away from Israel culturally as an engine for Jewish culture, despite all the complications that we experience on a daily basis with the realities of Israel. Having said that, the creativity that goes into the Hebrew script today, in Israel in particular, is actually inspiring. And I think it can serve as an engine for binding Jews together in their identity. So the Hebrew script has a power that's long been, I think, part of the sanctity of the script, not a metaphysical sanctity, but a cultural sanctity. And I think that can continue to be developed and enjoyed. I'm just going to give you one last example that you have on the bottom of the page, which I think is a fascinating example of the creativity in the Hebrew script. So can you see what's going on here? Naomi, no cheating. But of course, Hebrew is a very gendered language, right? So we struggle with this in English, how to formulate things in a gender-neutral way. Right? Rabbi Graber was talking about translation earlier, right? How do you translate ish in a way that's gender-neutral? Tough question. But there's an English question. It's even harder in Hebrew, because every single verb and adjective has to be masculine or feminine. And so if you're talking about a table, no one really minds that the table is masculine. But when we're talking to students, let's say, you're writing the instructions on a final exam, 2 generations ago, the default was simply to use the masculine, right? Right? Right. But what if we want to be gender neutral? Really hard. So in the last generation, there's a dot in between the masculine and the feminine ending. But one graphic designer said, you know what? When you look at it, masculine and feminine endings are not that graphically different. So she developed a font that is perfectly legible ambiguously, right? So you can read this as Kol Hanashim Shavot or Kol Ha'anashim Shavim. The Bruchim Haba'im, Bruchot Habaot, I think is probably hard to read in the grayscale that it came out with. But besides the gender question here, which is really interesting, the more important part is that in Israel in particular, the Hebrew alphabet is a living, breathing part of culture. And what we get in a living, breathing culture that we don't get in a frozen culture that we live only as foreigners is the creativity and the vibrancy. And that's part of the Hebrew script that I think we really need to grasp onto again. Because script is incredibly powerful. Scripts are made up, developed every decade by cultures who want to keep their languages. They want to text in their language. And they know that the only way to keep the young people speaking their language is if they can have an alphabet that can write their language. My taxi driver this morning from the airport to Durham grew up in Senegal, where an alphabet called ENCO was developed in the 1980s for Mande languages of West Africa. It's a new alphabet that's just 40 years old because people feel like we need to express ourselves in a script that's ours. We don't want to look like French. We don't want to look like Arabic. We want to look like Senegalese. Happens to be born in Guinea, but it's in Senegal now. So we want to look like Senegalese. But that sort of vibrancy and cultural richness and creativity that comes from a script, we have that. We Jews actually have a script. Right? It's not about the original script, because the rabbis of the Talmud already said, don't confuse originality and antiquity with sanctity. That's two different things. But there's a script that's ours. It's been ours for more than 2,000 years, and it's something that we can grasp and hold. And when we hold it, the idea is not just to hold it and preserve it in a museum, but to create with it, to use it as a way of expressing our identity, mark our identity, and linking up with Jews of the same culture, no matter what language, no matter where around the world. So, on that note, I wish you Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much.